most bakers around the world are basically using the same types of bread flour. As people have been growing grains, some strains of grains produce better, higher yield. You can plant them closer together. There's shorter varieties of wheat. And what ends up happening over time is we all start eating more and more of the same flavors, the same grains. And what I'm trying to do is go back in time to a point in which basically where you traveled in the world, you got grains that were local to that area, and as a result, you got different flavors and traditions and nuance. I'm trying to grab some of those older grains and incorporate them into our mixes. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I've prepared a recipe. I've tested it at a smaller scale in the garage, and now I'm ready to test it at a slightly higher scale here in this facility. My first step in this recipe is going to be to prepare the Khorasan, the whole grain Khorasan berries. So I'm taking 10 liters of water and I'm setting it to boil. It's going to take a minute for all of this water to boil, and I don't have a lid for this, so I'm actually putting a little bit over 10 liters so that I can account for a little bit of evaporation. So this guy is now just needing to get hot. Again, this is a fair amount of water, so we're going to move on to the next stage of the process, which is actually to mill some fresh flour. I'm gonna go next door to where our little mill is and mill the flour that I'm going to add to this water. There we go. So we're here by the mock mill. I recently dug this up from the basement, and now this one, we have 2 of these, and they are going to become central to the rest of this year for us. Again, I'm trying to bring ancient grains to our menu and trying to give people a better understanding of what these grains taste like. There's a lot more that you can do with artisan bread, and so I'm trying to take our bread program to the next level. These are Khorasan berries, and so I'm going to run them through the mill, turn them into a flour, and then add the flour to that boiling water over there. So turning the mill on, the first thing I need to do is just make sure that the stone is set up at the right level. So there's 2 stones in the inside, they're small, and you can change how far apart they are from one another by using this lever here on the side. So I'm currently opening it up, but I actually want to close it to the point that it just barely starts to grind like that. Now I know that the 2 stones are just barely touching together. If I go any further, that noise gets louder, and I know that's too much grinding. So now all I need to do is mill 5 kilos of this flour. This is the freshly milled flour that I made just the other day as I was testing this recipe. So we are still going to use it in today's mix, obviously, because it's a day old, but I'm making a much bigger batch. My first batch was, I mixed 2 very small mixes, one that was just 2 loaves, another was 10 compared hydrations, and I actually made them both at home, at the garage, and at the bakery. So I did the scalding, which is the process that we're about to do after this, at my house, on my range. Then I came here and did the mix. Then I actually went back home with the bread, shaped it there, and baked it off this morning. So I'm basically on test 2 now. And even though I had a really good result, I'm very excited about the flavor of this bread. A good result at a small scale doesn't mean that it's ready for the bakery either. I have to be able to prove that I can do this at a scale of, say, 60 loaves at a time at least in order for it to make sense next door. So this milling process, we're not a mill. So for us to make bread this way is somewhat inefficient. Imagine if we had to mill all of our flour and wait around for it like this. But we have a grocery store right up there. It's closed right now because it's, baker's hours at this point. But what I'm trying to do with this program is work on a project that hits both of my companies. I want to start introducing freshly milled flour here at the grocery store, and so I'm planning on activating these 2 mock mills here, where our store clerks can actually mill fresh flour for customers. Meanwhile, they can also hopefully mill some flour for proof as well that we can use the next day. We are going to little by little introduce more and more of our own freshly milled flour. Maybe one day we'll need a bigger mill than this. Just like initially I was hand mixing, and now I need a mixer that allows me to mix up to 250 loaves at a time with a removable bowl. So little by little we can introduce better flour to our customers. And by better flour, I mean we can get all of the benefits that come with these ancient grains. So as bakers, as grocers, we have a lot of discretion over the final food that our customers are eating. And when it comes to ancient grains, what they have that modern wheat doesn't have are different nutrient profiles. Also, a lot of different flavor and nuance there. Consider that we don't grow these as often as we used to because we grow more dense, high-yielding things now. But what we lose in that is we lose all the benefits of biodiversity. So typically, the grains that are heirloom, that are heritage, that are ancient, often have deeper root systems. Those root systems add more back to the soil. And farmers can use them in a different way in more traditional agriculture where we were really tending the land and caring for it. Given the types of things that are happening in the world around us and with our environment, I think that creating more diversity in the types of grains that we eat is just generally beneficial for humans going forward. Some of these grains have different growing conditions too. So buckwheat, as an example, which is one that I want to explore more, is grown as more of a seed alongside wheat and has been used as a safeguard if the wheat crop fails in a given year. Rye has a similar use case. So, if we want to have a more resilient food economy, we ought to be growing more diversity in the types of grains that we're consuming. It not only helps our nutrition, but it helps biodiversity in general. So I think that between the store and the bakery, we can tackle this problem. So this is a test, and I'm really looking forward to how this scales up to both the brands. Currently, I have about half of the flour that I need so far. So if I get close to, if I get up to the 6 and add that, there's no question I should have enough flour to get me what I need today. But it's going to take a minute to get all this milled. I'm going to add some in. All right, what makes this freshly milled flour any different from the other flours that we use? Well, it's whole meal for one. It's the full wheat berry. There's no sifting that's happened here. The whole wheat berry went in, the whole wheat berry came out. Now, the outer layers of a wheat berry actually typically have the most nutrients. They also have the most toughness. Think about it. A seed is protected from the outside so that moisture can't just immediately get in. It's meant to be on the ground for a while, perhaps a whole season before it sprouts. So the wheat berry has some protective layers on the outside. Those are the bran in particular. And when you're making white flour, the goal is to get just to the inside, the endosperm. So white flour is just endosperm, that inside starchy portion of the wheat berry. However, you can tell that this flour is anything but white. It has a golden yellow to it. Because we're also a long fermentation sourdough bakery, we're making sure that these kind of tougher nutrients are actually available to you nutritionally in the final product. The bioavailability of them is high. So in order to also produce a loaf that doesn't taste like sand, we have to take some new steps in the process. So if I were to just add this flour to some water and mix like I normally do at room temperature, I might get 70% water to the weight of this grain, the flour. I might be able to get 70% water to incorporate before it starts getting soupy and not workable. If I were to make a bread in that range, it's going to be grittier, sandier, heavier, really rustic. What I want to do is use more modern approach, which allows me to add a lot more water to my final bread, and it's called scalding. So this water is hot now. I'm gonna grab a temp gun just to see if it's hot enough. It's not quite boiling, but if it's hot enough, I'm gonna go ahead and move forward with the process. What I'm gonna end up doing is combining the hot water with the grains and mixing them. In preparation, I need to temp my water, I need to measure out my grains and get everything ready. This is a big enough batch that if I add the grains to it and try to stir it myself, I might not do such a good job getting the stirring going. It might be a little bit too heavy. So I'm gonna utilize the mixer. Whereas just if you're doing this at home, you're gonna do this at a much lower level. There's 2 times as much water as there is grains, just as a side note. And if you're only making 2 loaves, well, you're gonna need very little of this grain. And so you can just literally get a small simmer going in a pot. It takes no more than a couple minutes at home to get it boiling. Then you add half the amount of flour and just stir it together. It takes seconds to do at home. My process in the bakery for this bigger batch is going to be a little bit more complex. All right, so this water right now is temping at 187 degrees. It's not too far off from boiling at this point, and it will do the job to scald. What I need is for the final end result to be over 160 degrees in order for the flour and the water to gelatinize like they're going to. This flour is not cold. I want to debunk a myth that stone milling doesn't heat grains. 2 stones rubbing together create friction, and these grains are warm to the touch. We can actually find out exactly about 110 degrees in the middle. So it's not a small amount of heat that mill generates. So what I'm gonna do is measure out 5 kilos of flour. Watch us not have enough. I have 3.3 so far, looking good. gonna be just right. So 5 kilos of flour volumetrically looks more like 7.5. Obviously there's some air here, it's not fully compressed. But this is a perfect demo of why we use weight-based measurements and not tablespoons and whatnot. Weight is just far more reliable. I'm gonna add the flour to my bowl and add this boiling water on top and get it to the mixer. So this is a very short process. I literally just have to bring these two things together. And it's sort of a remarkable process because if you did this cold, there's no chance that you would end up with anything but soup. There's twice as much water moisture as there is grains in this bowl by weight. And it ends up forming this gelatinized substance that we can then incorporate into the mix after it cools down. So that's all I need. I don't need any more stirring. It's nice and even. We're good to go. So this is the process that I still need to perfect to scale, because this process will be added to our overall workflow, and it's not something that we've ever done here. You can tell by me fumbling around for equipment to get it done. But what's worthwhile about it is I can take this whole grain, ancient grain, that otherwise would be kind of razor sharp in my dough and take away from dough structure, and create this starchy paste that's soft and does not tear at the rest of my dough. And so I can create a nice, modern, light, airy, delectable loaf, but I can introduce all of the flavor that comes from this particular grain. And you know, if you're here right now, you can smell the rich smell of this grain. You could smell it in the milling process. White flour smells like nothing. So that's the difference, is we're starting to play with the same type of grains that our ancestors were actually baking bread with, except we're making bread in a modern way that's still light, airy, appealing, whereas perhaps if you ate a loaf from a few hundred years ago, you wouldn't find it that appealing because, you know, people got by with whatever they could make. Obviously, there's some amazing bakers out there making really interesting things, but everybody baked. Most people baked at home, and if not, every village had a baker. And you know, baking was more of a necessity than just an art. So you ate what you had, I think. The bread, you know, if it was heavier, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Today, I'm trying to introduce these older techniques, but in a way that's appealing to our audience. All right, so I have this base scald, and I'm really happy with it. You can see that the texture is interesting. I'm still amazed by the fact that there's twice as much water by volume as there is flour. That might not mean anything to somebody that doesn't bake, but somebody who bakes can appreciate what, you know, a liquid starter, the starter that we keep, Harriet, is 1 part flour, 1 part water, and it's pretty liquidy. This is like a mass that's come together, and it's not liquidy at all. I need to cool it down before I can bake with it, so we're gonna move on now, and the next step's gonna be mixing the actual final dough. But in order to do that, this has to go from its current really hot state into something a little cooler. So we're gonna take a break from this. So right now our Khorasan scald is in the walk-in cooling down. It's a well, it's a big bowl, but it's in a giant walk-in, so hopefully it's cooled down enough that we can use it. Typically you would want to wait, you can even refrigerate it overnight before you go to use it. You don't want to introduce 160-degree scald into your dough. You're going to get way too hot. Terminal temperature for a sourdough starter is 130 degrees. So if you heat your dough past 130 degrees, your natural wild yeast in that sourdough starter is going to start to die off. So I'm going to get some of the other things prepped for our mix and then pull that scald from the walk-in and see where we're at with it. So I'm just removing from this whole bag of flour what I need to take away at this point. And this is an organic flour called Artisan Baker's Craft. It's really well known here in the West Coast in particular. It's type 85 whole grain flour. And in terms of kind of base bread flours, really it's a great one. So the rest of this bag is going to go into my final mix. I've got that set aside for flour. I'm going to go ahead and get my water measured up as well. And based on yesterday's result, because this is still a trial run, I'm going to actually up the hydration of the water some. Now I'm going to measure my starter right into that water container. And here is a look at a mature sourdough starter. Nice and bubbly, really, really active. You can see the bubbles on top popping from the activity in the sourdough starter. And this is ultimately what at the core makes our baking different than most store-bought or commercial bread, because to bake with this means you're fermenting your loaves and you're baking them over a long period of time. That changes the nutritional qualities of the bread that you consume at the end. What we're doing here is layering atop of an already really old school traditional process. All right, the starter does a pretty good job of passing the quote-unquote float test, which is a way of measuring the activity of your sourdough starter, which can be a little bit misleading. But essentially, a mature sourdough starter should have a lot of gas buildup on the inside of this mass, which should cause it to float in water, and that gives you an idea that your sourdough starter is ready to use. So in this case, it's a pretty good view that this starter is nice and happy and active and ready to put into our bowl. I'm going to go ahead and grab the scald now out of the walk-in. I've also been in here a couple times and have turned it over just so that it can cool. But we'll get a final temperature reading of it and make sure that it's safe to use. So this part's really hot still. I'll get a couple readings so you can see. 108 there, but in the middle, oh, not bad. It actually dropped down. So that part's cold. It must have been the part I just turned. But here I'm getting a reading close to 130 degrees, 127, 126. A lot of it's at a decent temperature. Some of it isn't. What I'm going to do to bring the temperature down the rest of the way is get it on the mixer and get it mixing. So give it a couple minutes of spinning around. My hope is to get rid of the really hot spots. I did intentionally use colder water than I normally do to counter this. The sourdough starter's cold, so the temperature is going to be dropping. The flour is also much colder than this. So everything I'm combining it with is colder. But I don't want to start with a 110 degree dough. That's just too warm. Final dough temperature in the mid 80s is really all I want. So I got to be careful. It's best not to rush this process just to get it going. The temperatures need to be right. But this is one of the benefits of doing this the night before too. Preparing your scald along with your sourdough starter, chucking it in the fridge, letting it hang out overnight, and then by morning you can just go right to it instead of worrying whether it's safe or not to do so.
Is that last table looking?
So I have to measure out my salt, and we're also adding a little bit of honey into this dough, about the same amount as salt, just in the 2-3% range.
Hey guys, can I speak through?
Salt content, I'm gonna go ahead and put it in with the base flour. And then lastly, I just need honey. This is 60 loaves that I'm mixing right now. Got the honey. Get another temperature reading of this guy. See if it's a little better to use. Now I can at least assume that most of this is going to be at a similar temperature because it's stirred up a little. And I'm no longer above 100 degrees, which is great. It's right around 99, 100 degrees, most of it. And combined with all the other ingredients, we're gonna be fine on temperature now. So I'm gonna drop the bowl, and I'm gonna go ahead and add the rest of the elements of this mix. Last but not least, is this flour salt mixture. So this mix doesn't get an autolyse. The reason being is there's not quite enough water outside of the scald in the sourdough starter to do an effective autolyse. If you go back in some of our other videos, you'll notice that an autolyse is kind of a central feature for most of our mixes. It allows flour and water to combine together, releases some enzymes, builds flavor, and adds dough strength. We're omitting that here because of the different formulation here. But as we add more water to the base mix, I can start considering the autolyse. So this is not a final recipe yet, still a test recipe. Really happy with it, so happy to make it and sell it as bread, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to change it over time. And really adjusting hydration is one of the bigger variables right now to decide on for the final dough. Most everybody has already commented on the fact that we could up the hydration in it, and I did, but I upped it very incrementally, and I haven't done the calculation on what that amounts to. I think it's gonna end up being maybe a 5% bump in hydration, maybe even less. I'll have to do the math. So the first bit of this mix is just combining all those ingredients, including the scalded flour. Once we have a nice smooth dough, then I can kick it up into higher gear. By smooth, I mean I shouldn't see any flour residue. It should look more like a rough batter than kind of clumps of flour. So we're about an hour out of the mixer at this point, which means I want to start my stretches and folds. The dough is not fully developed in the mixer, especially this whole grain, whole milled component dough that we've made. It can benefit from the handwork that we do. So we do a number of folds up into the table, and each time we're trying to strengthen the gluten that's in there and create just a stronger overall dough. So I'm going to take this guy and stretch it as far as I can without breaking it. Fold it over. I'm rotating the bin and doing the same thing. So each time I do this, I'm lengthening the gluten strands and building some strength into the dough. I'm only going to do it to the point that I notice that it's starting to get a little weaker. So in that case, it was just 3 folds. Sometimes with our other doughs, we stretch 2 or 3 more times each time we touch the bins, but this dough is a little bit stiffer and it doesn't require more than that. One thing I noticed since being in this bakery in particular, and it probably was happening before, just didn't notice it, that we lose a lot of temperature in the bins from the dough. So you can start the dough a little warmer. If our goal is to get to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, let's say, the dough can be substantially warmer than that, even 8, 9 degrees warmer than that. And each time I go to fold it, I'm releasing heat. All right, so this one's all set. We're going to do this a couple more times. That's it for this round of folding. I'm gonna let this dough sit for probably another 45 minutes and relax back out. So in the folded state, the dough is a little bit smaller in mass in the bin, and as time progresses, it kind of relaxes back out. I'm gonna let it relax back out, then come back at it, stretch and fold again. So each time I'm kind of developing the web of gluten, making it stronger, making it stretchier, and making it more, making this whole loaf more something that I can manipulate a little bit better over time. So now that we've freshly milled, scalded, mixed, stretched, and folded, we're finally ready to make the actual final loaves. They have a little bit more hydration than yesterday's batch. See how that plays. What I want you guys to do is pre-round them. Typically when we hand divide anything, we pre-round it here. You can use the bench knife and just round. Here, I'll scale it first and show you. Never actually scaled on this scale yet, so I can't decide if I like it yet. So here's 800. It feels a little sticky, so I like the bench knife for stickier doughs. And I'm just going to basically make it cohesive and then set it aside. Let it relax, and then we'll shape those. So try to place these in a way that we can then work from the oldest first. So I'm gonna divide and throw down to you. If you throw a little bit of flour on it, you can.
Kind of like that?
Yep. Just trying to basically build the outer crust kind of in a decent tension. A little smoother, so try to work it a few more times. Yeah, that's better. If you can do with this dough, the regular, if you ever have to hand divide the regular doughs that we have, they're gonna be a lot easier. The bench scraper technique is something that you kind of gotta practice before it makes any sense, but it's basically like you're rounding and then finishing with your left hand. In both ways, this dough is kind of hard to get smooth, without a doubt. So don't feel too bad. So right now, basically, all we're trying to do with this pre-round is set ourselves up for success in the shaping. Some of these are better than others. As you guys get better, the key with the pre-rounding, I think it's a pretty good metaphor. Amanda decided somewhere along the line to say that the way that you know that you did a good job here is like, does it have the feel and look of a nice butt? But I think that in general, like wholemeal bread like this lends itself to chunkier result. So as far as shaping, we're gonna go oldest to youngest and do this similar to the sourdough. Try to be gentle with this dough and be mindful of the fact that it's just gonna tear more easily. We don't want any shaping errors. You want a nice, consistent roll. Shaping error would be like if you happen to shape it in such a way that you're leaving a big pocket of air that never quite closes. That's something to be mindful of in all of your shaping, but this one in particular is probably gonna be more prone to it. Like this spot right here could easily become a shaping error. You might shape a little different than this, or it might have been shown a little different, and that's fine. I'm trying not to interact with a huge portion of the loaf at any given moment. That's how I find that you end up like sticking to it. And I'm not gonna overdo it because of just how sticky this dough is. Less is more in terms of handling. I do like scooping with a bench knife, which helps close the seam. Same type of roll up and done. The main difference is just the texture of the dough is gonna be more challenging. So let's see what you guys got. So this is a very small bake for this oven. So these are our Khorasan loaves ready to go in the oven. They just came out of cold fermentation where they were for 11 hours. And now we have to bake them off. You can see, so again, this is a trial batch and you can see how it is different from some of the other dough that you've probably seen on our belts before. Even though with all of the components, the scald and whatnot, there's a huge water content in this dough, it still shapes and feels more like an old-timey dough with 60% in hydration. But it's actually in the high 80s. I am gonna grab a little bit of rice flour because I liked the way that it looked on these. So the rice flour is really just for contrast. What I noticed in my initial trial bake, because this is technically bake 2 for me of this, was that it colored very quickly in the oven, and the rice flour kind of helps balance that out. I don't mind getting to those deeper browns, although they often look a little bit more abrasive. A deep brown is definitely not burnt in taste. I'm gonna add a simple wheat stock to them. Check my settings really quickly. I've got currently 55% of the heat on the top, 45% of the heat on the deck. I'm calling for 5 seconds of steam, although I'm gonna change this to 7 because I don't have the other side. Typically in this oven, I'm loading 2 sides and I'm doing 2 doses of steam about 3 or 4 minutes apart. But given that I only have this many to bake, I'm gonna up the amount of steam on the one side. I'm gonna set a 15-minute timer, at which point I will release steam. So here we go. Going in. And these are off to bake now. You're gonna see how they change over the next few minutes. All right, so this came from the first batch of Khorasan loaves. I made this yesterday, baked it off of this morning at the garage. And I've been very excited about this bread, and so I wanted to make sure to bake it off so I knew what to expect in baking here today. And I also didn't want to wait to try it, so I tried some of the bread that I baked off this morning already, And now I'm gonna let the whole team try it. A lot of the team members, not everybody, but a lot of the team members have been hearing me talk about this method at our weekly meetings, which everything that I'm doing here is still not really a part of our production workflow. So I'm trying to give everybody kind of an intro to all of this as well. What I really noticed about this one is the crust was really well developed, but it had a distinct flavor to it. So keep in mind, this is a wholemeal loaf. There's a large percentage of wholemeal flour, and yet it's nice. It's soft. It's still going to eat really, really nicely. Whereas typically you associate like wholemeal, whole wheat bread as dense and unappealing. All right, you guys, first taste of Khorasan.
All right.
If you don't mind humoring me.
Thank you.
Fresh bread? Wait, what?
Right.
So I baked this in the garage this morning.
Did you?
And I'm about to bake some more here, but are you used to our local like our base sourdough bread? Do you feel like it has a different flavor? Can you taste the grain at all?
I think so.
I'm actually going to up the ante here. So here you go. There's the comparison. Trying to make the slice smaller so you don't have to. Being gluten.
Yeah, you can. You definitely can. Yeah.
Texture, so the new one, the texture still isn't like, think about the fact that I'm using wholemeal flour.
Right.
So oftentimes it's like a sandy, heavy textured. Is that what you're getting from this? Because that's what I was trying to avoid.
No, it doesn't taste sandy, but you can definitely tell that the crumb is a whole lot tighter.
Yeah.
And not as open as with the sour.
Still really good though. I like it.
All right. So I have base sourdough and I have Khorasan. Go ahead and try whichever order you want.
Smells really good. All right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I dig it. That's awesome. What are we doing?
Base sourdough,
Yeah.
Khorasan. What do you think? While you're just trying. First, can you taste the difference?
Definitely got more flavor in general.
This loaf baked up in 27 minutes, whereas normally we hold our sourdough for 35. It was getting so dark that I pulled it, so I didn't want to push it any further. Different grains caramelize different when they bake up. Different hydration levels, create different nuances in bread. I mean, at the end of the day, bread is flour, water, salt. So, like, the variance in the flour is one of the biggest variances you can make. So you can taste the difference.
Mm-hmm. I really like it.
Which would you choose between the two?
Definitely the new one.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
It's got more flavor and a more complex flavor as well.
That's what I'm going for. So thank you for saying all the right things. So that's our base, just whole grain sourdough that's been on the menu.
Tastes like sourdough.
Make sure you get some both crust and crumb, otherwise you won't get the full experience.
It has a really nice flavor. Yeah.
The crust is awesome. I love the crust too.
I like the crust on this one better than
Me too. What was interesting was 27 minutes in the oven, and it was like getting so dark that I had to pull it. Whereas,
27?
yeah, only 27. It's, I think, just a difference in the grains and how they cook up.